everyone, and welcome back to the BA Project, the podcast where we talk about the good, the bad, and the workshopping from your bedroom. Today, we're exploring in-person versus virtual workshops, and we will chat about what works best, how to prep for each kind, and how the setting of your workshop impacts the stakeholders. My name is Catherine, and I'm joined by my co-host Drew and Christina. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hello.
So firstly, I want to set the scene a little bit and give a bit of background about why I feel this topic is so important, and especially as of late. So I think when COVID hit, there was a rush to try and maintain efficiencies, maintain our stakeholder relationships, and be as productive as possible, even though we may or may not have been in our bedroom or wherever we were, and probably in our pajamas. So it set up
right
that
now.
kind of... You can only see here, right?
Yeah.
So that meant using virtual whiteboards, Teams, Zoom, and all that kind of good stuff. But now we're in a space where a lot more clients are looking for in-person workshops, and now we've had to actually revert all of the learnings that we've come across in the last 2 years and go back to basics, which presents another challenge of going back to what we used to do. So it's the ultimate BA dilemma. So I want to talk about what is best for us and what's best for our colleagues. But I want to talk about the challenges, first of all, of what we saw when we actually went into that virtual world and how we feel about going back out of it. So can you guys talk to me a little bit about the challenges that you faced?
Christina?
Yeah, so I would say from my perspective, I was onboarded in a COVID world. So I started doing, I suppose I have been an analyst for a long time, but doing this type of analyst work, I only know it from a COVID perspective. So I didn't have in-person workshops and things like that before I started working the way that I've been working most recently. So I'm kind of, I suppose I'm sort of going back and learning things, I suppose, that weren't first nature for me now.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole virtual element of it was just my bread and butter when I joined the current organization that I work for. Some challenges that I'm seeing now with reverting are, I suppose maybe we'll come on to that when we talk about reverting back to what we've had before. But for me, the only challenge that I really faced was trying to get clients into that way of working, because obviously it was brand new for them, but it was all that I knew. So personally, I didn't have challenges with adapting to that new way of working, but it was helping other people understand why it's the way that we've got to work now, and like the technology as well, like getting people set up to start with, people understanding Teams and Zoom the way that they need to, getting up to speed with virtual whiteboards. And like if you want it to be collaborative as well, you need other people to be able to interact with that virtual whiteboard too. So I would say technology was probably the only challenge that I faced, but when we come to talk about going the other way, I'm sure I'll have more challenges with that element of it.
With challenges, I'm a big proponent, like you guys, of in-person experiences. And I think when I think of challenges at workshops, I actually think about the virtual workshops, the challenges that I would have there. For example, with in-person workshops, you're much less likely to have a person disengage in front of you because they can't turn off their face when they're sitting across from the table from you. But when you're in a virtual workshop, they can turn their screen off, they can go on mute, and they can sometimes leave the room. I've been in workshops before where a person's put their camera on and they've been out for a walk as an SME or part of a project in one of my workshops. I don't know what that says about me as a business analyst. So you're just so less likely in an in-person environment for somebody to feel like they have the flexibility and freedom to be able to disengage to that level. So that's a big challenge, I think, getting that buy-in. But then the counterpoint to that as well is the flexibility of people being able to get to virtual sessions so easily. But it's really opened up your access to different types of stakeholders on a project.
Yeah, I think it's definitely been easier to have a broad spectrum of people on calls, which has been great, because that would have been a challenge in the old world of, well, we can only do this, first blue moon of every second month, or, whatever it was that kind of got people into the room. So I think that's definitely gotten easier. But one of the things that I now find hard about in-person workshops is just the overhead of carrying a flip chart, carrying sticky notes, like I did one recently, and I just couldn't believe that I actually felt like there was way more prep for my in-person workshop, which never seemed like a challenge before. But I think it was just because I was out of that habit of kind of needing all of this collateral and all of these kind of big, heavy props to kind of bring with me.
Sorry, do you remember like pre-COVID where you would have your stickies on a wall, you'd have pictures of the stickies on the wall, the whiteboard, or you'd have an actual, I used to have, I will get back to my question. I used to go to IKEA, and they do massive rolls of paper that for kids like paint and color on, but like massive, like 30-meter long rolls of paper. And I would buy that for process mapping, and I would have this like 10-meter long piece of paper and blue tack it to the wall, and we'd map out the process. But after that workshop, I would have to go and transpose that to Visio, or transpose that to some tool where I was making that digital. So that in itself was just such an overhead that you're factoring into your write-up time that you don't have now. Even with Miro, which is an app that the three of us would use, you can take a picture of that and it would digitize it for you now. So the whole world of workshopping is so different now. But that's the challenge, at least, that we don't have anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Catherine.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, when we were talking about like overheads and things like that, something that I found of late going back on site is incorporating the travel time, and even logistical things like having to find parking or things like that. Like, that's something that I've not really had to think about in the last 3 or 4 years. But now I'm having to think, oh, well, I can't have another meeting just before that because I've got to factor out 45 minutes travel time to get on site. And then like after a workshop, like we're all the same, we like to write up straight away if we can, but if you've got to factor in that travel time to either get back to your own office or you've got to find a space where you can work in that on-site facility, like that's something I'm kind of being faced with a challenge with like very recently. So just things like that, and with although the virtual workshops allow a lot more people to attend, it nearly makes people too available. And you know, if people see a gap in your diary, they will go in straight after. They'll go in, you know, 11 to 12, 12 to 1. And I think that's not just with workshopping, not just with the role that we do. I think that is something that people have found just with this virtual world. And like when you're running a workshop, you do come out socially exhausted as well. And you need a bit of time to decompress before you jump right into your next call. So I would say that even though it lets us bring more people together in a virtual world, I think it is a bit of a strain to be able to come away from that and just have to jump straight into the next thing as well.
Yeah, and that's probably a bit of advice that I would always give to guys on the team, of saying like always block book your half hour before and half hour after, even if it is in virtual, because you definitely need that space to just not be thinking of anything else but your prep, and not to be thinking of anything else but decompressing. Or I think like that, especially if it's 3 hour long workshop, you need a bit of time out, and people just don't get that when they're in a virtual world. So before I move on from this, I have a little quiz.
Oh no.
So
you never said there'd be a quiz.
I know. But that is the fun. It's only one question, but it was something that I actually hadn't heard of. So I want to know if either of you guys have heard of production blocking, and if you can guess what it might mean.
Never heard of it. Frantically Google production blocking?
No, you may not. Well, this is an interesting thing, because actually when I was doing a bit of research of what actually has been said around virtual versus in person, the studies are actually really, really different, and especially different when it comes to the topics that you're looking at. But apparently for brainstorming, one of the biggest issues is called production blocking, where somebody might have an like really creative and really great idea, but they suffer from in-person challenges of too many people talking at the same time, too many people talking about different topics. And actually they find that brainstorming or that kind of creative element is less likely to kind of be well done in a virtual setting rather than an in-person, which I thought was interesting.
Wow. That's super interesting. I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, I thought it was, like, especially when you think of when we go on to their next topic, which is the benefits. And I think one of the big benefits of virtual is that you can actually give people a bit of space to maybe, you know, if they're nervous of talking in public or kind of presenting an idea. I think one of the benefits of the virtual space is that actually they feel a little bit more comfortable. And so, yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the benefits now. What do you guys think?
Do you mind if I go?
Yeah.
Benefits there's benefits to both for sure, and we spoke about the flexibility that virtual workshops can give you, or virtual collaboration can give you. If we look then at the in-person benefits, I think anytime, whether that's internally or with customers, that I'm in front of people, I personally, me, Drew, the business analyst, gets more, and I get more value, and I get more energy from being in front of people than being behind a screen. So that's a benefit to me, and that drives me because I get my energy from other people. So that's a personal benefit that might not be obvious to other people. And I'm sure there's people out there that have more confidence behind that screen because they feel maybe protected. And I think as well, another benefit of in-person is getting that buy-in and the trust, and those conversations that happen before and after a workshop or halfway through a workshop or on your break are so intangible because it's not task-oriented. It's not about a project, or less likely to be about a project or an outcome or a deliverable, and you're talking to another human about human things. So, and I think that's hard to quantify, which you don't get when you have back after back, meeting after meeting scheduled. You don't get those opportunities. So that's a massive benefit, is getting that buy-in from that group of people, that group of stakeholders, that customer, from them seeing you as more than just a resource on their project.
Yeah, I would agree to that, Drew. So like the opportunity to build a rapport with people through in-person workshops is just unmatched. Like, it's so much easier to have an open and honest conversation with somebody, even when you get back virtually. But once you've been able to have an in-person interaction with them once, I just think that you can have the difficult conversations a bit more easily. So being able to build that rapport is just a massive thing. And you get to, like, we as business analysts need to adapt our communication style depending on the audience that we're chatting to. And sometimes if somebody doesn't have their camera on ever at all, it's really hard for you to understand how you're being received. Whereas if you can meet them in person, there's no opportunity for them to hide behind that. And then you can see how your own personality is landing with somebody. And I've found that once I've met people in person, when I maybe thought that they, like, it didn't get on with them so well, or they weren't as receptive to my ways of working or things like that, it just turns out they don't fancy turning their camera on. It's just never something that's worked for them. And then when I meet them in person, it's completely flipped it around, and then it's a much easier interaction moving forward because I feel a lot more comfortable because I know that they're accepting of my way of working. So although it does take travel time and there definitely is additional prep, and something that I find a bit more challenging in person is that we don't have our Miro board to be able to hide behind. We can still use Miro, but like where I'm sitting right now, I have a big massive monitor, so I can split the screen in two there, and then I've got my laptop screen, so I've got 3 places where I can have all the materials that I need. Whereas if I'm in like an auditorium or something like that, then I have one big screen that's behind me. It's huge, and I only have one screen, so I can't have other materials to hand in the same way that I do here. So although there's those overheads, I think the opportunity to build a rapport with the client makes the rest of the interaction a lot easier moving forward.
Yeah, I think in person, people are just less likely to be as awkward as they might be if they can shut off their camera and hide behind a screen. And especially, Christina is so right, of you do that once and that like you've broken the ice already, which I think is nice. So yeah, I think that's a major benefit for in person. But for me, the benefit of virtual, of not having to go somewhere, is so nice and so important. You know, I, like before COVID, trying to get to a workshop for 9 a.m., being on public transport or something, you know, like you just found that you were getting there almost a little bit flummoxed, and already you're kind of on the back foot, which I think was such a nice way of working, of being in a virtual world. You could log on early, try and chat to people, you know, in that setting. And I think as well, there's a niceness to be able to almost kind of dictate how the day is going. Where I think in person that's a little bit harder to do. So I kind of like that with the virtual world. There's a little bit more of this is our agenda, this is what we're sticking to. And I find it easier to shepherd people actually when I'm in a virtual setting rather than in person, which I think is probably, you know, again, that's just going to be a personal choice or personal preference. But I definitely find it easier to kind of say, okay, guys, look, we'll have a break now and we'll come back. And you're not losing people to, well, I'm going to just actually take a different meeting or something like that.
There's one more I wanted to add, just on the topic of the virtual benefits. Both of you guys are BA leaders, and I know you would have had these challenges previously and maybe even currently. When you're resourcing projects and you're looking at people in your team who can go where and when, being able to assign a BA to an engagement, a task, a customer, and not having to worry about them physically getting to that place or being geographic restrictions or restrictions due to visa or access, whatever it might be, having that freedom to be able to plan your resources, your BA team based on the work rather than the logistics is incredible. And for yourself, Christine, example, you've had an opportunity to work in projects and for customers that are based out of Dublin that would have been probably challenging for other people, or even challenging for yourself if you had to get down there 5 days a week every day. Like you're not gonna do that. It would have been so unachievable. And having the freedom for you to be able to do that is great for us, and hopefully great for you as well. So that's a huge benefit as a BA leader, is having that freedom.
And actually, on top of that, I think sometimes you think of virtual in all of the virtual kind of capacity and all of in person, whereas one of the big benefits of where we are at the minute is that, Christina, you can be coming down to Dublin to host an in-person event, but you are actually carrying your virtual props, which is your Miro board, your Teams, and all of that prep is not physical anymore, which is just, it's just a huge benefit of being in the space where we are now, where we're a little bit in between and we want to be flexible and adaptable in our approach, and we want to kind of eyeball people as well to get to know them and have those human conversations, but we also don't need the overhead of carrying a tripod on a train. So like I think so I think it's nice that we have that little bit of a hybrid at the minute.
But you know, one of the things that does scare me on that, maybe this is just me, but does anyone else get freaked out when they go to a new venue for the first place and you worry about, is it going to have a HDMI? Am I going to have to press weird buttons? Is the audio going to work? Like I freak out about that every time I go into, even if it's a place I've always been before, but they put me in a different meeting room. I completely freak out, and that's silly because like nobody is going to laugh at us for not being able to find the right cable or something if it takes an extra 5 minutes to set up or something, and like the client will know how to do it, but that just gets in my head more than like the subject matter or more than anything else. The tech gets in my head. I don't know if that's just me, but
that's not as legitimate. There's so many scenarios like that. Like, what if the blue tack doesn't stick to the wall? How do you tell a customer that their walls are greasy?
But that brings us on to our next topic of what is the difference between prepping for a virtual and in-person workshop, because there's definitely stresses that come with both. And like that, some of the stresses are things that are smaller, or you feel like they're insignificant when you say them out loud, but actually in your day, if you've taken 10 minutes or 15 minutes to actually set up your laptop while people are still in the room, you almost feel like you look ineffective or like you're a little bit behind. So yeah, I think the prep is definitely a huge consideration when we think of which one we're going to go with on a certain day. But talk a little bit more about that prep scenario, Christina, because I think that's a perfect example of a stressful situation.
Yeah, and like I'm my own worst enemy with that, because I don't like to do things by halves. So if I have an opportunity to interact with people, I'm going to try and make the most fun as possible and do games and do manila envelopes of instructions and tape them under the desk. And like, I probably overcommit myself to things, knowing that I'm not, like, when it comes to levels of prep, I'd say like Drew and I are fundamentally different with how we like to prep for things. I like a bit more excitement in my life and maybe a bit more winging it.
Jesus, Christina, thanks.
Well, yeah,
Sometimes you just have to fly by the seat of your pants and it all happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, so sometimes I would say that myself, I maybe overcommit and try a bit too hard to make the thing exciting and put a bit more pressure on myself to be prepped. But there definitely is a different type of prepping for in-person ones, even like to making sure that you've considered like the break times, and is there going to be refreshments provided, and is that something that you need to organize yourself, or is that something that your client's going to do for you? All those things that you just never have to consider if you're doing a virtual one. Whereas like if I'm doing a virtual workshop, I just need to think about, like, no, I'm in an open office, so noise levels in the open office, I have a really good noise cancelling headset, so everybody else around me doesn't really affect me. But am I going to affect other people? I do, because I'm very loud. I do consider that. But really all the prep I've got to do is get from the kitchen back to here in time for go time, and make sure that all my Miro boards and everything are prepped. So I have a much lesser prep to do for my virtual ones. But that's a me thing. I think that the fact that I like to put so much effort into my in-person ones, because I don't get to do them all the time, I probably put a bit more pressure on myself to make them more interactive versus maybe how I should, or maybe other BAs would.
I think by nature of it, you, like, when you're in person, you don't want to be, you want it to be interactive. You want them to have some sort of engagement, because it's almost too obvious when you don't get that you kind of feel like, oh God, am I just talking to the wall here? But it was funny when you mentioned those kind of logistic stuff of setting up laptops, and it wasn't actually for a workshop, but for training. And I remember I got to this event, and it was basically, I had to plug in my laptop, which meant my whole screen was going to be shared, which meant I didn't have the ability to look at my notes or look at my script, which is something that I completely had taken for granted, that in the virtual world like that, I was able to have my script on one screen, my Miro board shared, but then my Miro actually open in Chrome, so I could change my Miro as I went, or I could make notes, or, like, I think everybody's done it, but like, get onto your IT guys and be like, this is not going to work. I can already tell that there's something wrong. And that was always so nice in the virtual space, that you could kind of get ahead of things, or ahead of blockers and obstacles, or something that was slightly not working very well, and you could get ahead of that. But I think when you're in person, you just get caught out so obviously that your prep has to be much more of a checklist, much more of, what am I going to do when I get there? Do I have everything from my share screen, from like my notes, from, like a handout of PowerPoints or whatever it is? And I think it becomes so much more taxing to prep in that way, when you, especially like from our perspective, we're going on client side, so we just don't know what they have in that room, and you're kind of potentially only getting into the room 5 minutes before your start time.
So that I found it can be quite helpful. You're not going to use it all the time as well, is supporting customer prep. And I know it's dangerous, especially if you're in a fixed price, but where you're on a project and maybe you're mobilizing and you're using tools virtually that a customer hasn't used before, I would definitely build in time into your estimates for a Miro walkthrough or for an Azure DevOps walkthrough, so there's no surprises. And you as a business analyst or an organization, you have that cover. When you get 3, 6, 9 months in, excuse me, you can point to that particular moment in time where you've done that prep and you've brought them on board. Or even when you first get in front of that SME group or a stakeholder group and they're in a workshop, you want them to be confident enough to be able to move around. Someone isn't going to put their hand up and say, I'm completely lost here with this new tool you showed me for 20 minutes last week. So I think if you can do that demo session on those products beforehand, before you're in that workshop series and you're full steam ahead with no time to lose, I think it's going to serve you well for the lifetime of your project.
Which nicely, thank you, Drew. You're so good at my segue. Brings us on to the last topic of how we need to interact with people when we're in the virtual space versus in-person space. And I think this is really important, because we've touched on it obviously in the earlier topics of how people can disengage in the virtual space, and that's, you know, a bit more obvious. And but you can have obviously people disengaging in person, and also, you know, you can have difficult people who might not be as difficult when you see them in person. But I definitely think there's an element that changes with our stakeholder management between each of the areas. So yeah, can you guys talk about that?
With the in-person stuff, one of the things that I have learned to do is to set out my stall around like break times and things like that. So all of the time when we go into a workshop, like, we've got to appreciate that those people that we're engaging with have business as usual jobs that they'll still need to be working on. They'll still need to be able to have time to respond to emails and things like that. And we can't take up their 9 to 5 day without any break or any interaction with their normal job. So I sort of set out my housekeeping, or set out my stall at the start of my in-person workshops, and just say that we will have, here's the break times. If these don't work for you, let me know and we can work around them, or we can just sort it out at the start. But
yeah,
I'm only here for one day, and I would like to get as much from this as you guys would. So can you work with me on availability and being able to pay attention? And it's about making people comfortable, because like you said, some people just aren't comfortable to speak up in a public setting, and it is sometimes easier to just pop a question into the chat or to keep their camera off. But I find that you've got to work extra hard to make people feel comfortable so that they can interact during an in-person workshop. Because sometimes, again, using me as an example, you'd get a loudmouth like me in a workshop that might not stop talking as a client, and then the rest of the people on the project team might not feel as though they have a space. So you've got to look after the ones that are a bit quieter and try and make them comfortable to pull them out of themselves, because you can identify that more in person versus what you can in a virtual workshop. And I feel like if people don't have their cameras on in a virtual workshop, it's really hard to sort of control that or set out your stall as to when people should or shouldn't be engaging with you and should or shouldn't be checking their emails. You can't police it when it's in a virtual setting, but in person you can sort of set out your commitment and hope that people will commit back to you.
Yeah, and again, when I was doing that bit of research of what actually has been found in studies, I came across an article that actually said that virtual groups ultimately generated more ideas. So when it's coming to that kind of maybe discovery piece, and, you know, where there's a little bit more creativity, actually being virtual is going to stand to you. And apparently the bigger the virtual group, actually you get more ideas, which is funny because it goes against that production blocking, where actually when you're in person, you don't get those creative ideas being generated in a larger group. So I thought that was interesting, because I would have always advocated for smaller workshops where you're kind of saying maximum 15 people. And even at that, that's quite big. Whereas, so it was interesting to see that some studies had actually found that larger groups could find or could generate more ideas. But I think maybe that comes with the idea of, like, what are you brainstorming or what are you workshopping? Because if it needs to get down to decision level, that's not going to be applicable.
I wonder, is that born out of a place where the more people here around me suggesting ideas, the less weight there is behind me getting one wrong, you know? Or if I do get one wrong, it's more diluted because there's a higher volume of people in attendance maybe. But that's really interesting. I would have thought the complete opposite.
Yeah, and I think it probably just stands to, like, you know, if you're a little bit shyer, if you're a little bit quieter, or the people who are maybe new to companies are most likely to be quiet in a in-person event, because they're the ones who kind of feels like they're going to maybe get caught out. Whereas in a virtual, they might feel a little bit more confident in that space, which is great.
When I think of stakeholder management, and if we think about stakeholder management in person versus virtual, something that I think is actually a constant across both is the lack of control that we as business analysts have on that attendee group once that invite gets sent. I'm always so interested to see, once you have an elicitation plan stood up, it's sent across to the business, you've worked and collaborated on it together, the amount of times I've been in workshops and a random person has appeared that wasn't on that elicitation plan. And that happens whether it's an in-person workshop or it's a virtual workshop. And that's something that I think we will always struggle with, is trying to control that attendee group. And maybe we all just need to be harder with ourselves and making sure that we're staying true to the original attendee list. But I think that's always interesting. No matter if it's in person or virtual, it's so tough to make sure that we have the people that we want and need in those sessions.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's easier than like when you're presenting a Miro as well, because then you can kind of say, this is what we did the last time. And you can almost kind of pinpoint the person who wasn't there the last time, but you can do it in a little bit more of a easygoing type way where you can say, well, look, David, I don't believe you were here the last time, but this is, the Miro board that we walk through, and you can almost do it as a summary. I think sometimes that's in person can be a little bit direct. So I definitely prefer to do that when I'm in a virtual setting as well.
Do you ever find like when you're having an in-person workshop, sometimes people just think it's a bit of a day out and they maybe don't take it as seriously, and their outputs aren't as strong as if they were in a virtual room? That's something that I find, like, and like we do want to encourage that community and collaborative element when we're in person, but sometimes it can just be, that somebody's just really glad to be away from their desk, or they're glad to be out of the house and away from home life.
They're
And
there for the sandwiches.
they're there for the Sammies and a bit of a party, and they're maybe not as, so maybe that speaks to why the virtual ideas might be better, or there might be more of them, because people are just there for a bit of a wee half day out or something. But like, it's nice for us to be able to get out for a wee half day out as well, and maybe it brings a bit of a bubblier personality, I find sometimes.
Yeah, and I think some of that is actually the invaluable element of in-person workshops, where actually it's really good to be in an environment where people are just talking about sandwiches. And if you've had a particularly bad project, or maybe something has been escalated, or you're maybe not as effective, or the project hasn't been as effective as it could have been, they're the moments that people get together and kind of say, okay, I'll try and do my best for you. And I understand, and you get that little bit more of a friendly environment, which you just don't get, especially if people are not using their cameras.
I have a question for you guys. Where do you stand on breaks in workshops?
You have to have them.
Now, say for example, pop quiz time. No, say for example, you have a 3-hour workshop. How much time are you giving, and when do you give the break?
Well, say if it's 10 to 1 for 3 hours, I would definitely say that we have like from at 11:30 to kind of 11:45 break. And I would try and factor in kind of 15, 20 minutes, because I think apart from anything, people's minds just go completely off the wall at that point. And you're better off building the time, as Christina said, for BAU work, rather than losing your attendees at different points to emails, to phone calls, chats.
And I found with breaks as well, you have to be so strict, almost teach you like with timings, and tell them that 15 minutes sharp, because you can't lose that extra 5 minutes where people come back after a cup of tea, so on and so forth. So I'd be quite tough on the timings and let them know that we're going to get started in 15 minutes, whether you're there or not, and they can catch you up, or we'll catch you up in the chat. So I think it can be tough if you don't set that standard with them, especially if you're going to be working with these SMEs on a project for the next year. If you're losing 5 minutes for every break per workshop 3 times a week for 3 months, that's a lot of time. But I think it's interesting, breaks. I remember when we used to do day-long workshops, AM, PMs in person, and you would be exhausted as a facilitator, and I think it's a different kind of exhausted when you're remote, because you're looking at a screen, your eyes are tired, and you're engaging with people that have cameras off, cameras on, and you're zooming around, in and out of windows. But it's also difficult when you're standing in front of a group of 15 people in a room, artificial lighting. It's a different type of tired, but completely gone on a tangent. I don't know what my original point was. Sorry. Maybe I need a break.
One thing about breaks is, though, that we as facilitators often use those breaks to try and fix things. So we don't get the break. Like we don't sometimes, like, personal experience, I wear heels on site. I am very small in stature, so I like to get a couple of extra inches in my height when I'm on site. So I've got sore feet because I've been standing all day. I've had to use my brakes to get onto the blower with the techies to see why something isn't working, not being able to grab lunch because I was trying to get things fixed or prep for my second session. Like, those breaks aren't necessarily for us at all. They're a chance for us to try and fix things a lot of the time. But going into virtual workshops, I always make sure to have an agenda set out. So that's something I've been doing for the past, I think, 2 years now. Just even if it's on my Miro board, 3 bullet points as to what we're covering today. And if it is like a 3-hour workshop, I'll say I'm going to try and get through point 1 and point 2. But if I find a natural break point elsewhere, then we'll take a break then. I think natural break point is probably one of my most used phrases. That's probably like a bingo card for me. But it's good to find that natural break point. And again, take a temperature check with your audience to say, look, are people feeling burnt out? Do we need to take a 5-minute? A bio break is also a nice term that I used to like to use.
Bio break.
A bio break. People need a bio break to just go and grab a cuppa or use the services or whatever. Bio break's a nice wee 5-minute-er.
Yeah.
That is such a materialism or a Christinism, if I ever heard one. A bio break. I'm going to take a quick bio break in my workie. That's
you got to grab a Sammy. I'll grab
a Sammy. It's ifs and buts and coconuts. That's another one that I like to use. We need to iron out the ifs and buts and coconuts. Bio break, worky. There's all of those sorts of things. Need a glossary of terms.
And one of the things that I've found actually with this is lately I've been on the other side of workshops where I have been potentially in a sales workshop, or I have been on the receiving end of like workshops and demos. And I definitely have a newfound appreciation for the people who are joining and not facilitating, because I actually think when you're facilitating, you're in the zone and you're working with your agenda, you know exactly where you need to go. Whereas the people in the room, kind of, when the question isn't directed at them or it's not their area, you kind of have to be conscious of pulling them back into the room because they will zone out. And I think that's a really important piece of knowing that your stakeholders are the right people that are in the room. If there's a rando, as Christina would say, that has just popped in, you're going to have to figure out where they fit and what's relevant to them.
It's a good point. And when we went overnight to being remote facilitators in the BA community using tools like Miro, Mural, Microsoft Whiteboard, and other tools, that was one of my fears of losing the power of the pen, being able to hand somebody a marker and say, show me what you mean. Or if you're trying to figure out the relationship between A and B, an entity and another entity, whatever it is, process steps, being able to hand someone a whiteboard marker and say, show me, that's so powerful. And you're going to find out really quickly that person generally knows. And that's something that's difficult to do with Miro, I think, unless they're actually fairly handy or you've done a decent tutorial, so they're fully on board.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys, and thank you for joining us, and we hope you found it insightful. Please comment below and tell us what you think, whether you agree with us or not. We'd love to hear from you and your experiences with the virtual versus in-person workshops. And also, if you want to get in touch with us or if you want to write for the BA Project, you will find us at thebaproject.ie or thebaproject.com, or simply the BA Project across social media. Thank you.